Alright, let's do this one more time. My name is Sam Carrico, and for the past 3 years, I've been the host of the one and only Film Fan Club Show. We've got a great show for you lined up today. Later on, psychologist Alex Langley will be joining the show to talk about his new book, Spider-Man Psychology, Untangling Webs. Yeah, of course, Across the Spider-Verse is our big topic today, and rightfully so. Just looking online, Spider-Gwen is currently trending on Twitter. Oh, sorry, that's actually my Pornhub tab. But first, let's go back to 2018. It was only 5 years ago, but the movie landscape was so different, specifically the Marvel movie landscape. Back then, Marvel movies were at their peak, regardless of studio. Avengers: Infinity War, Black Panther, Deadpool 2, Ant-Man and the Wasp, Venom, and lastly, Into the Spider-Verse. They all came out that year, and they're all better than what we're used to now. Just take a look at Disney's MCU. Multiverse of Madness, Thor: Love and Thunder, and Wakanda Forever are all arguably a step down from their predecessors. Even Quantumania was worse than Ant-Man 2, and that's really saying something. Compare that to how Sony's Spider-Man movies have evolved in recent years. After Amazing Spider-Man 2 flopped, they had to beg for Kevin Feige's help in rebooting the character. But they didn't let that discourage their larger ambitions. I'll admit both the Venom movies are pretty average, but Into the Spider-Verse became an anomaly for them in the best way possible. Produced without the help of Kevin Feige, this Sony animated feature was truly special, with a unique comic book-esque style and a storyline that's so good, the live-action movies later copied it. That live-action movie was great, by the way. No Way Home remains the best MCU movie since Infinity War, and the fact that the best part of Phase 4 was produced by Sony and not Disney speaks volumes. So while Into the Spider-Verse was exceptional, that was to be expected from our superhero movies back then. Which brings us to present day. Disney is now at their lowest, and Sony is at their highest. And even though Across the Spider-Verse is a step down from the first film, I found it to be miles ahead of anything else we've gotten recently. First of all, this movie is just too long. Part 1 of a two-parter, it's more bloated than me after a visit to the craft services table. The storylines of Miles Morales and Gwen Stacy were well done. I needed Spider-Gwen solo movie like yesterday, but the script seemed to suffer from studio requirements to go bigger and crazier than before. One or two sections of this film could have either been rewritten or dropped entirely. The first one, by comparison, was a lot tighter, much like I imagine Gwen Stacy's "oh, forget it." The script does, however, continue the excellent blend of humor and heart established in 2018, and the core cast get a lot of moments to shine. Haley Steinfeld's performance here is maybe one of the best vocal performances in recent memory. She's able to breathe such a life into this animated character in a way that's truly captivating. Oscar Isaac is also a welcome addition to the cast as Spider-Man 2099, and I really enjoyed where the plot took his character. The animation here is mostly still impressive, but when it reaches a baseline and isn't trying to do the comic book gimmick, it can look a little wonky, almost like a video game cutscene. Although that could be because I saw this one in a theater and the first one was at home. Speaking of animation, the whole multiverse aspect of the plot provided some live-action cameos that I found to be really jarring, like suddenly I'm watching Who Framed Roger Rabbit. But I guess that is to be expected from Marvel projects now. Roger Rabbit aside though, I'd still like to play patty cake with Gwen Stacy. Bottom line, this movie is not as good as the first one. It's probably not as good as No Way Home, but it's still more imaginative, more compelling, and yes, better than anything Disney's done in years. It's worth supporting for that reason alone. Alright, we've got a great show for you lined up. Let's get right to my interview with psychologist Alex Langley talking about his new book, Spider-Man Psychology. Alex, welcome to the show. How's it going?
Hey, it's going great. Thanks for having me.
I'm happy to have you here. Obviously, Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse is, at the time this being released, it's now in theaters. So we're obviously excited to talk about Spider-Man. And I was like, I couldn't think of a better person to talk about Spider-Man other than the co-editor of Spider-Man Psychology. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
What is it about Spider-Man character in the various, iterations that makes him or her such a juicy character when approaching it from a psychological perspective, and particularly what made you want to be involved in this particular Spider-Man project?
The beauty of Spider-Man, I think, is his relatability. We can, each of us, I think, relate to Peter Parker much more directly than we can with many other superheroes. I am not a billionaire whose parents were murdered in front of me. I am not an Amazon goddess. I don't have any magic rings, but I am a guy who sometimes life dumps on, and sometimes I don't have enough money or have girl troubles, or I struggle to keep all my social relationships together. And that is the essence of Peter Parker, is that he is this guy whose life is frequently fraying at the threads, and he is trying to keep moving, trying to do the right thing in spite of the difficulty of balancing out his real life and his superheroic life together.
And making that kind of like you mentioned, it's relatable, but then taking that and applying it to different, not only as the generations go on, but not only different generations, but different gender, different races. It seems to be something that is so relatable. What makes it something that Miles Morales can be Spider-Man, Gwen Stacy can be Spider-Man, everybody can be Spider-Man.
Right. I mean, as Miles says at the end of Into the Spider-Verse, we're all Spider-Man. It's because ultimately Spider-Man is the spider hero, is this character who tries to do the right thing in spite of the fact that it's making their life actively harder to do the right thing. Part of what I find so interesting about Peter Parker is that he's incredibly noble, and yet he is not without his ignobility. He will web sling off after the cops and leave behind a social engagement, leave behind a party in his own birthday party. He'll web sling after the cops because there's a robbery in progress. But he'll be muttering about it the whole time. We were just about to get to the cake. We were going to get to the good stuff. Mary Jane is going to be furious at me, that kind of thing. And so it's just so interesting to me to explore that element of him, because with superheroes, there's always kind of an inherent duality to them, but how much duality there is to them varies from hero to hero. And with Spider-Man, I think that duality is more present than arguably any other hero. I mean, few other heroes do you get those shots like you do with Spider-Man, where it's Peter Parker and Spider-Man together as he's thinking something. I mean, especially with the early Ditko comics, you would have moments where it's Peter and he's kind of like, looking a little selfish, and Peter Parker has the selfish thought bubble coming out of him. Then the Spider-Man portion of him has the selfless, the noble thought coming out of him. And so we as humans, we're all multifaceted. We're all complicated creatures. And I think the complexity of Spider-Man having this inherent conflict between his selves, and also just the sheer existence of these two distinct selves who are very interrelated and yet also distinct from each other. I think it makes for a really, really interesting character who continues to translate across media, across time, as you said, across different representations with gender, with race, etc.
And another, I was just thinking about it too. Like Batman, when you think about Batman, and I'm doing this intentionally this time. Batman, he underneath it, it's not he's Bruce. I mean, really, the real personality is Batman. That's who he is at his core. Underneath Spider-Man, there's Peter Parker. There is well, depending on which version, a high school student with girl trouble, like you're talking about underneath it, but at the same time, there's Spider-Man, which is the responsibility that's often put upon a person. Again, comparing to Batman, Batman's a person who's trained his life, like even taking out the rich part of it, he's trained his whole life. Batman, or Spider-Man rather, is a responsibility that's put onto an ordinary person, whether it's Miles Morales or Peter Parker or even Gwen Stacy. And I think that's also something that's very relatable. The idea of this greater purpose being put on you. And that's something they really go into in the first Spider-Verse movie, and the idea of like, am I ready to be it, and rising to the challenge. I think that's also very powerful too.
And that particularly with Miles, that's something that's really interesting. We have a whole chapter in the Spider Psych book by my friend Richard Michael Calzada, who exploring Miles as the Latinx African American Spider-Man, and they're aspects of his life that are different compared to Peter Parker's, because as a person of color, he is more often reminded of the weight that is placed on him with opportunity. Miles gets to go to the science high school in the comics. In the movies, they stole a lot of, in live action MCU, they stole a lot of Miles' background inexplicably to give to Peter Parker.
Yeah.
But in the comics, Miles goes to the science high school. He gets opportunities that a lot of kids, particularly kids of color, don't get. And he is frequently reminded of that. And that's something that, people of color are constantly told, like, most folks, they're not going to get these opportunities that you do. And so, and I think Into the Spider-Verse also, it's correlating that with his powers. He has this power and freedom that goes along with it, but then it's also, he can feel that additional responsibility for being the person of color and having that weight placed upon him as well.
This is just me again, like I said, as we talk about the book a little bit, I figured I might just start thinking of questions along the way. Is the aspect of survivor's guilt, whether in the context of Spider-Man losing Gwen Stacy or Spider-Gwen losing Peter Parker, is that really a topic that's approached? Because that's something I found fascinating about the Spider-Verse movie.
Absolutely, yeah. That survivor's guilt comes up quite a bit with Peter Parker. Guilt informs his behavior so much. Guilt over Uncle Ben, guilt over Gwen Stacy. I mean, he's got a few other significant deaths that still weigh on him as well, but like Gwen Stacy, Uncle Ben, like those are the two big ones that weigh him down over time. And so that's part of the reason for that almost obsessive and sometimes flat out obsessive need to be out there and be doing things, because he is constantly struggling with those guilty feelings on some level over having his feeling that he let them down, and that if he just keeps swinging, if he just keeps doing, then he can prevent someone else from having to go through the same pain that he and his loved ones went through. And with Spider-Gwen, especially with Spider-Gwen, we see survivor's guilt very directly addressed. In her comic, she's got her world's Peter Parker. She also had Spider-Britain, the big muscly Spider-Man from another universe who gets killed by Morlun, or one of the inheritors. And she was very good friends with him and looked up to him, and his sudden death weighs on her. And also being this multiversal traveler, Spider-Gwen is constantly looking at the graves of other Gwen Stacys and wondering why are they dead and why am I still alive? And so with her, we were really able to explore existential psychology, finding meaning in the briefness of our lives and the inevitability of death. And that exploration ties into Spider-Gwen's whole journey and going from Spider-Woman to adopting Spider-Gwen to finally adopting Ghost Spider as her title, with the adage that death loves Gwen Stacy. She makes peace with the inevitability of death, and she makes peace with her own ability to know that she can still make a meaning out of her life, however brief it might be.
That's beautiful. This is why I bring you on for like that. I would have never read that far deep. I took a little tiny kernel and I was like, she must feel guilty, about her boyfriend dying. And you're like, yeah.
You picked up on it. You picked up on it though.
Oh, yeah. That's so fascinating. My gosh. See, this is why I need to get the book so I can read that. This is the hopeless romantic in me. I do love, and then the fact that they're, multiversal travelers, whether it be Miles or another version of Peter Parker. Or, I love the idea of Spider-Gwen and meeting another Spider-Man and being like, oh damn, like I couldn't save mine, you couldn't save yours, let's look out for each other. It's very heartwarming.
I agree. That's why I like that moment a lot.
Yeah, I just watched. I just watched the first Spider-Verse movie, and the ending where the portal opens up, and she's like, "Hey, you want to hang out for a minute?" And I'm like, Barry, the adventure continues. Look at those kids. I hope they make it work. It's very sweet. Just briefly want to touch on the villains. I don't have a lot of questions about the villains other than just kind of broadly speaking. I mean, they are all very fascinating from a psychological perspective, whether you have, the big one's Norman Osborn, but also you have Eddie Brock and the symbiote and these types of things. Can you talk a little bit about the villains, or the villains mentioned in the book?
Yeah, we talk at length about the different villains. We talk about analyzing them in terms of their motivation. We talk about analyzing them in terms of psychopathy and psychoticism. Motivation is an interesting one for a lot of Spidey's villains because, Spider-Man, while he deals with his megalomaniacs, Doc Ock, Green Goblin, like they are megalomaniacal villains, and he does deal with some other megalomaniacs. Most of the villains he is most famous for dealing with are your street level thugs. And so their motivation tends to be very, very different than your egomaniacs. Green Goblin becomes Spider-Man's nemesis because Norman Osborn has conquered the business world and decides, I'm going to make a name for myself as a criminal. And the first thing I'm going to do is take out this Spider-Man around town. Spider-Man.
Yeah.
I'm going after him. You know? But if you look at like Shocker, he becomes a super criminal because he got tired of getting busted as a cat burglar, and he invents his vibrating suit and vibrating shockwave blasts to, you know, break into safes without getting caught. And Electro, same thing, you know, he gets zapped when he is just trying to make a quick buck and help somebody who needs help, but not out of the selflessness of his own heart. And he's mostly just looking to steal some money. Electro was an interesting one because really digging into him, you see how hard he works not to kill people. Electro, you know, for a guy whose powers are electricity, he puts a lot of work into trying not to kill people. His first encounter with Spider-Man, he's like, hey man, stay back. You know, I don't want to have to rough you up, Spidey. And just numerous times over his comic book history, he's a guy who, like, yeah, he's motivated to try to get some extra cash and fulfill those very bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You know, the very primal, primitive ones. But he also doesn't want to be a killer. And you know, with someone like Venom and Kraven the Hunter and also Doc Ock, the three of them, they are very as Spider-Man's villains, because obviously Venom, you know, he has his whole role as an anti-hero over the years, flat out hero sometimes. But if we're looking at him in terms of as the villain to Spider-Man, as his antagonist, it's ego driven. Same thing with Kraven. Kraven decides Spider-Man is the ultimate hunt. Doc Ock is constantly having his ego threatened by Spider-Man. Kingpin, same deal. And then with Venom, he feels that his life was ruined by Peter Parker / Spider-Man, and the symbiote is mad that Spider-Man tossed him out. And so the two of them feel that by pursuing Spider-Man, by trying to fight him and take him down, it can help assuage their wounded ego together. And so, you know, Eddie is the only one who kind of gets over that, although he still has his moments. But the others, you know, they are so against him. Doc Ock decides to possess his body to prove that he's so much better than Spider-Man that he can be the superior Spider-Man.
What a silly, not a silly, I don't want to judge, but what a crazy, wacky comic or story. For
I know that Dan Slott had pitched that sucker for years, and he kept getting told no, until finally they're like, fine, do it. But then he does it, and the whole thing, I'm like, yep, this is terrific. I get it. And it gave us a lot to talk about with Doc Ock in terms of his journey towards something approaching self-actualization, actually being the best version of Doc Ock he could be, which is the version where he gives up being Spider-Man and gives it back to Peter Parker because he recognizes Peter Parker really is the superior Spider-Man.
Damn, look at you, just again hitting it with the looking deeper. And I'm just like, what a wacky story. And you're like, yeah, but if you look at how it affects Doc Ock as a character. I want two quick things. I thought it was interesting that you mentioned the ego aspect of Kingpin. I thought it was an interesting crinkle that they've gone with a lot, the aspect of his Vanessa in the Daredevil series, and then also in the Into the Spider-Verse movie, that the fact that Vanessa and him had a child and they all died, and that he has kind of going back to that survivor's guilt that we talked about. And another thing that I think was I like in concept, but not in practice, is Sandman in Spider-Man 3. Having a working class guy, as he says, I'm not a bad person, I've just had bad luck. I think that's a great addition to you know, Doc Ock losing his mind, and Green Goblin being a maniacal supervillain and also losing his mind. But again, just didn't quite work for that film.
You know, it's in that moment, it is a little wonky, but like if you pull it back to the larger picture, it does provide some interesting elements to Sandman, because Sandman is another one kind of like Electro, to where it's like, yeah, they're thugs, you know, they're thug hoodlum criminals,
right?
But they're not necessarily looking to like hurt people. That's not their number one thing. And with Sandman, like in the comics, he becomes a supervillain because he feels slighted by a girl who rejects his advances, and he's like, well, I'll become a criminal, and she'll think I'm cool after that. And so the comics, and also in Spider-Man 3, like his motivation is still ultimately in that Maslow hierarchy of needs for love and belonging. Like he's motivated by love in both of those.
That's so interesting. So this is in obviously we're talking about Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse is the big
Yeah.
movie. Like I said, at the time of this release, it's in theaters. So I want to
Woohoo!
ask how if you could talk broadly or get however specific you want to in any direction. But I just wanted to talk about how your thoughts on the first movie, Into the Spider-Verse. How did
Mm-hmm.
that interpretation of either Peter Parker, Peter B. Parker, Miles
Mm-hmm.
Morales, the characters in that film, how did that
Mm-hmm.
film inform your approach to this book, or just how did you like the movie?
Love the movie. I absolutely love the movie. I rewatched it a couple of times working on the book, and each time just appreciated it more and more. I mean, for just artistically, it is an aesthetic feast. Visually, the audio of it, it's one of the movies that I think does the best job of incorporating a lot of the most striking elements of comics
Hmm.
into a film without coming off as hokey. Like that, I absolutely love that. And then as far as story and character, I love it as this exploration of Miles as this good, smart kid who, weirdly enough, in a lot of ways, has a better life than Peter Parker. That's something that we see explored in Into the Spider-Verse. That's what we see explored into the Sony Spider-Man game
Yeah,
or Miles Morales Spider-Man.
yeah.
That's also something we saw explored fairly recently and a storyline that sent Miles back in time. And so in this story, Miles Morales, he gets sent back in time to the Pete's like early days of Spider-Man. So
Oh,
it's roughly issue like 31, and it's
that's interesting.
he meets Peter Parker when he's just gotten home after the night where he was trying to save Aunt May's life with the blood serum that she desperately needed, and Doc Ock traps him under the waterlogged rubble, and so it's that very famous sequence of Spider-Man having to lift the
Yeah.
huge rubble off of his back. It's a sequence that we talked about numerous times. We had to, in fact, it came up so many times that we had to like make a list and go, okay, we have to talk about it here. We need to cut it here because it's just such an iconic moment for
Right.
Spidey. And it was interesting, Miles coming and visiting Peter Parker and seeing how kind of beat down and depressed this 15-year-old kid is, and Miles realizing that, like, yeah, I have it tough, but he's like, I got parents,
Yeah.
I have friends. We have a little more money than Peter does. He's like, life is not as bad as it is for Peter Parker. Um, and that is a good look into the emphasis on interconnections with Miles. Pete cuts himself off from the people in his life a lot because of the burden of being Spider-Man. We see it, the Sam Raimi films, we really see it repeatedly, him constantly cutting himself off. And we see it in the comics, all over the place, Pete cuts himself off. Whereas with Miles, he is from the get-go a much more interconnected person and interconnected hero. In the Spider-Man Miles Morales game, the first thing we see of him, he's walking down the street, he's greeting people in his neighborhood in their own language, English or Spanish. He'll also speak in American Sign Language because he's fluent in sign language as well. So he's connected with the people in his neighborhood. He's connected with Genki. He's connected with his folks, although in the game it's just his mom. It varies a bit as to whether he has one or both parents. Nobody's quite settled on, does he have his mom? Does he have his dad? Does he have both? Does it,
Yeah.
but with Miles, yeah, he's a more interconnected character. So his web spreads out, whereas Spidey is more of the upside down thread he hangs from. His is a little more isolated.
And last thing I want to bring up before we sign off
Mhm.
is the new movie Across the Spider-Verse. I
Mhm.
imagine, have you seen the trailers or anything like that?
Oh, absolutely, yeah, for
So
sure.
what are your kind of anticipation level going into this movie? What are you expecting? What would let you down if they didn't?
I'm super psyched. I watched the first trailer for it,
Okay.
and then I've gone on media blackout after that
Smart.
because, well, the first one I was like, they knocked it out of the park so much, and that trailer looked so good that I was like, I trust them. So I think this is going to be really good. As somebody who has recently read a lot of Spidey comics and read a lot of like multiversal Spidey comics, there are so many different Spider people that will be interesting to explore to see if they are, going to be featured in the movie. Obviously Cindy Moon, we I talked about her a bit on here, love that character, but there's also, your I think Spider Punk, I think he's in it, the hard rocker British Spider
Yeah.
Man, I think he's in it. But there's so many different Spider people that I would love to see. I'm not going to pronounce it. I've only read his name. I haven't heard it pronounced correctly, so I'm going to say the Spider-Man of India.
Okay.
I would love, I hope he's in it. I hope that we see just more of the different Spideys and how it is that this concept for the character can be translated so cross-culturally. And I think the reason that we see so many multiversal Spider-Man stories in comics and in the films is because of his cross-cultural connectiveness and his universality. When one of the smartest things that Lee and Ditko did with creating Spider-Man was to create that top to bottom costume. We don't see a scrap of skin on the guy,
right?
Yeah. And so with Stan, he expressed that helps Spider-Man be someone that anybody can look to and identify themselves with. You can look like, obviously, his physique's not going to match all of us. I don't have Spidey's physique. A lot of us don't have Spidey's physique, but still, we can look at him and go, anybody could be Spider-Man under the mask. Like with Batman, he keeps that. We always remember that Batman is, and in most depictions, it's a white dude.
It's a white dude under there.
Spider-Man. With Spidey, it could be anybody. And so I think, everything about him is relatable and universal.
I think that's a great note to end on. Alex Langley, thank you so much. The book is Spider-Man Psychology, Untangling Webs. It's right there. You can see it on screen now. If you're watching this, it's available now. Thank you so much, Alex. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was fun.